The afternoon sun lay like molten gold across the terrace streets of Monte Carlo, throwing the facades of the Belle Epoque hotels into soft relief and setting the polished motorcars gleaming like mirrors. At this hour the Riviera was at its most indolent. Gentlemen lounged on wicker chairs beneath striped awnings, white Panama hats tilted back. Ladies in flowing frocks strolled languidly along the promenade, their parasols held aloft more as an ornament than a protection from the sun. The smell of salt drifted on the warm breeze, mingling with the faint perfume of hot stone, petrol fumes, and exotic blooms from the hotel gardens. Into this serene tableau came Hercule Poirot, as precise and orderly as though he had been lifted directly from the pages of a Parisian fashion plate. His linen suit, pale as almond cream, bore not a single crease. His shoes were of patent leather, reflecting the afternoon light in small, immaculate crescents. And above all, there was the moustache, that magnificent adornment, curled and gleaming, to which Poirot devoted as much care as a soldier might to his saber. He had arrived in Monte Carlo the previous evening, intending nothing more strenuous than a fortnight of rest, excellent cuisine, and perhaps the occasional hand of cards. But as always, Poirot's little gray cells were never truly on holiday, and as he walked at his measured pace toward the Place du Casino, he observed the scene before him with a quiet, appreciative interest. The casino itself stood at the heart of Monte Carlo like some gilded temple to fortune, its facade pale as ivory, its windows glinting in the sun. Carriages and motorcars lined the crescent-shaped drive, and a small crowd gathered near the steps to watch the arrivals, princes and exiled dukes, celebrated dancers, captains of industry, and the occasional English clergyman whose wife had dragged him there under protest. To Poirot, it was as fascinating as a theater. Each arrival was a little performance, every gesture a clue to character. It was as he stood thus observing that a small incident caught his eye. A young Englishwoman, no more than 25, emerged suddenly from the great doors. She was dressed in white from head to foot, hat, gloves, and frock all of a delicate simplicity, and she held in her gloved hand a folded piece of paper. For a moment she stood quite still at the top of the steps, her face pale, her expression one of curious tension, as though she hovered between tears and laughter. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He had the peculiar gift of recognizing emotion in its subtlest form, and this young woman, he felt, was not merely the victim of a run of bad luck at the tables. There was something more significant, more personal in her agitation. A man came striding after her, a tall man with a weathered face and a military bearing that was unmistakable even at a distance. He placed a hand on the girl's arm, spoke to her in low, urgent tones, and after a moment's hesitation she nodded. Together they descended the steps and crossed to a waiting motor-car, a sturdy, rather old-fashioned touring model with English plates. Poirot noted that as they drove away, a third figure emerged from the shadow of the colonnade. This man was tall and dark, with a thin face and the sort of elegant stoop that one sees in professional gamblers. He lit a cigarette with leisurely grace and watched the car depart, a faint, sardonic smile playing about his lips. Poirot felt the first faint stirrings of curiosity. This little scene, the pale girl, the bluff soldierly companion, the lurking observer, was as perfect an opening act as any dramatist might contrive. Later that evening, at the Hôtel de Paris, Poirot dined alone, for he was not a man to seek company merely for the sake of it. His table afforded him an excellent view of the lobby and the revolving door that led to the street. He had just concluded his repast with a small but perfect portion of Cherry's Jubilee when the very same young woman entered, accompanied by the gentleman of that afternoon. Her face was now composed, but the eyes betrayed a certain tension. The man looked grave, preoccupied. They passed into the lounge and took a seat near the window. Poirot, though he would never so far forget himself as to stare openly, allowed his glance to rest upon them with interest. He observed that their conversation was of an urgent nature. The girl's hands were tightly clasped together. The man leaned forward, speaking in a low tone. Once she shook her head vehemently. A few moments later the tall, dark man entered the lounge. His evening dress was faultless, his hair slicked back to a shine, and a carnation knotted in his buttonhole. He paused upon seeing the pair, then, with an air of faint amusement, selected a chair at some distance and ordered a drink. Poirot's mustaches twitched. The little drama was taking shape. The cast was assembling. That night Poirot took his customary stroll along the terrace before retiring. The air was warm, faintly perfumed by jasmine from the gardens, and the sound of the sea came faintly from below, a soft and rhythmic murmur. The moon hung low, silvering the white balustrades and turning the whole of Monte Carlo into a dream of pale light and deep shadow. As he stood thus, hands folded upon the handle of his cane, Poirot reflected that the Riviera, for all its glitter, was a place where human passions ran high. Fortunes were made and lost in a single turn of the card, and with them came hope, despair, envy, and hatred, all the raw materials for tragedy. It was, he thought with satisfaction, an excellent place in which to exercise the little gray cells. The following morning dawned with the blue brilliance unique to the Riviera, the sea stretching away like a sheet of polished sapphire beneath the rising sun. From the terrace of the Hôtel de Paris, Hercule Poirot surveyed the scene with satisfaction. Below him, early motorcars hummed along the coast road, while the white awnings of the café opposite were already being raised in anticipation of the day's clientele. The air was still cool, but one could sense the promise of heat to come. Poirot took his breakfast with the utmost care, coffee served in a silver pot, rolls so light they seemed to dissolve upon the tongue, and a little dish of honey. He was not a man to be hurried over such a matter. When at last he rose and descended to the lobby, he found that the hotel was beginning to stir with its usual medley of guests. Stout German ladies bound for the beach, a Russian princess swathed in veils, 2 American businessmen engaged in earnest conversation over the newspapers. Near the writing desk stood the young Englishwoman whom Poirot had observed the previous day. She was addressing an envelope, her gloved hand moving quickly, as though she wished to be finished before she was seen. Poirot, with a courtesy that was natural to him, bowed as he passed. She started slightly, returned the bow, and in that instant Poirot had a clearer impression of her features. She was pretty rather than beautiful, with a delicately pointed chin, and a complexion that suggested outdoor pursuits. But the eyes were troubled, and that troubled look was one that Poirot, who had seen it in many lands, associated with worry of a deeper sort than mere loss at the gaming tables. His opportunity to make her acquaintance came a little later when he was greeted by a fellow guest of some days' standing, a jovial French avocat named Jules Muttal, who had dined once or twice at Poirot's table. Muttal, seeing the girl hesitate near the terrace doors, performed a ready introduction. "Monsieur Poirot, Mademoiselle Evelyn Grant," he said with a flourish. The girl smiled a little shyly and took the chair that Muttal offered. Poirot, with old-world gallantry, inclined his head. "It is a pleasure, mademoiselle," he said. "You are perhaps newly arrived in Monte Carlo." "2 weeks ago," she replied. Her voice was pleasant, with that soft English intonation that always pleased Poirot. "My guardian and I have taken a suite for the season. He finds the air here most beneficial." "And yet," said Poirot gently, "you find the air, how do you say, heavy?" She glanced at him quickly, a flush rising in her cheeks. "You are very observant, Monsieur Poirot." "It is my profession, mademoiselle. I see things, little things. They are often of no importance until perhaps they are." At that moment, a shadow fell across the table, and Colonel Arbuthnot himself appeared. He was a tall man, still powerfully built despite the grey in his hair, and he carried himself with the easy authority of one accustomed to command. He greeted Muttal heartily and acknowledged Poirot with a brief inclination of the head. "I see you've met my ward," he said. "Splendid. Nothing like good company to keep a young lady's spirits up." But there was a faint stiffness in his manner that did not escape Poirot's notice, and he thought to himself that the colonel was a man under strain. The little lines at the corners of the eyes were more pronounced, and the hearty laugh came just a shade too readily. The conversation soon turned to the casino, for Muttall, like many Frenchmen, was fond of the tables. It was agreed that they should all meet that evening for supper and perhaps a turn at baccarat. Evelyn Grant's smile was polite, but her hand, Poirot noted, closed very tightly upon the handle of her parasol. That evening, the party assembled in the gaming rooms, where the great crystal chandeliers shed pools of golden light upon the green baize tables. Here the next act of the drama took shape, for Poirot was introduced to several other figures who were to play a part in what was to follow. There was M. Raoul Dullinge, tall and exquisitely dressed, with the sort of good looks that owed as much to calculation as to nature. He greeted Evelyn with a charm that seemed to make her draw back slightly, though she accepted his hand with a composure that spoke of careful breeding. "You play, mademoiselle?" he asked, gesturing to the table. "Not this evening," she replied, her tone cool. Dullinge smiled as though amused, then turned his attention to the colonel, whose bluff good humor masked a sharpness of eye that suggested he was no novice at the game. And then there was Signora Lucia Bullenty, a vision in emerald satin, her dark hair coiled high, her laughter ringing out across the room. She was attended by a younger man, a secretary or companion of some sort, who hovered about her with the air of one perpetually anxious to please. The signora herself seemed supremely indifferent to the whisperings her presence provoked. "A dangerous woman," murmured Muttall in Poirot's ear. "They say she has broken more hearts and fortunes than the roulette wheel itself." Poirot watched the interplay of glances at the table with interest. The colonel staked heavily and lost. Dullinge staked more heavily still and won, his smile growing as the piles of chips mounted before him. Evelyn Grant sat very still, her eyes fixed on the table, though she made no attempt to play. When at last they left the casino for supper, the colonel was in boisterous humor, though Poirot detected a note of forced hilarity beneath the jovial surface. Evelyn, by contrast, was pale and silent. Dullinge accompanied them to the restaurant, where his charm was directed chiefly toward the girl, but Poirot observed that his attentions were not entirely welcome. The signora joined them later, filling the air with her laughter and anecdotes of the Riviera set. To an outsider, it might have seemed no more than an ordinary evening among cosmopolitan acquaintances, but Poirot, who saw beneath the surface, detected the faint but unmistakable tremor of tension. Something was amiss, some secret current running between these people that would sooner or later break through into the open. Later, as Poirot made his way back to his rooms, he paused for a moment in the great hall of the hotel. Through the tall windows he could see the moonlit terrace, empty now save for a single figure, Evelyn Grant, standing motionless, her hands gripping the balustrade as though for support. Poirot's mustaches quivered. The drama, he felt, was moving toward its first crisis, and he, Hercule Poirot, was already seated in the stalls, watching with the eye of a connoisseur. The following day dawned softer, the light more diffused, as though a veil of gossamer cloud had been drawn across the Riviera sky. To Hercule Poirot, who was a connoisseur of such details, it seemed to portend a change not merely in the weather but in the spiritual climate of Monte Carlo itself. There was a new tension abroad in the air, a faint unease that could not wholly be explained by the sultry heaviness before a storm. After breakfast, Poirot strolled the gallery of the Hôtel de Paris, pausing here and there to examine the photographs of royal visitors displayed in gilt frames. It was while he stood thus, apparently absorbed in a portrait of King Edward, that he overheard two voices drifting through the half-open door of one of the salons. The first was unmistakably that of Colonel Arbuthnot Bluff Hardy, with that parade-ground timbre that years of command do not erase. But now it held a sharper edge. "I tell you, Dullinge, the matter must wait," the colonel was saying. "I have not the ready cash." The reply, smooth and faintly mocking, could belong only to Raoul Dullinge. "Mon colonel, I am not unreasonable, but you know as well as I that certain obligations must be met promptly. Delay will serve no one. Poirot moved on with a delicacy of step that belied his stout figure, leaving the two men to their conference. But his eyes were very bright. Money, always money. In how many cases of human tragedy had that simple, sordid element played its part? Later in the morning, as he descended the staircase, he encountered Evelyn Grant in conversation with Signora Bullenty. The girl's face was pale, her expression defensive, while the Signora, resplendent in rose silk, spoke with the confident ease of one who is dispensing advice, or issuing a warning. The girl curtsied slightly and withdrew, leaving the Signora to sweep past Poirot with a smile that did not quite reach her dark eyes. He found Evelyn standing by the writing desk in the lobby, fumbling among the postcards as though seeking occupation. Poirot, ever tactful, approached with a little bow. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "this morning you are not so gay. Something has occurred, perhaps." She hesitated, then shook her head. "It is nothing, Monsieur Poirot. I am merely tired." But as she turned, a folded paper slipped from her handbag. Poirot stooped and retrieved it with his usual courtly grace. For the briefest instant before returning it, his eyes caught a single line written in a bold hand. "The debt must be settled before the week is out." Evelyn flushed and murmured her thanks, but her fingers trembled as she took the paper. Poirot, who never forgot a clue once seen, filed the message away in his mind alongside the overheard conversation of that morning. The pattern was beginning to form. That evening brought a change in the social atmosphere of the hotel. There was, Poirot felt, an undercurrent of suppressed excitement, as though all present were aware that some crisis approached. Colonel Arbuthnot appeared at dinner later than usual, his complexion ruddy, his manner almost boisterous. He spoke loudly, joked with the waiters, and ordered champagne for the table. To the casual eye, he was a man in high spirits. To Poirot, who missed nothing, he was a man deliberately masking anxiety. Dullinge, seated opposite, was urbane and smiling, but there was a glint in his eye that suggested triumph. Evelyn, pale as the tablecloth, touched little of her food, and more than once Poirot saw her glance quickly, almost fearfully, toward the colonel. After dinner, the company drifted toward the gaming rooms. The casino was unusually quiet, the soft click of the roulette ball and the muted voices of the croupiers sounding almost unnaturally distinct. Poirot, standing a little apart, watched the colonel take his place at the baccarat table. He staked heavily and lost. Again and again he played, the color rising in his face, until at last he pushed back his chair with a muttered oath and left the table. Dullinge, by contrast, played with the cool assurance of one accustomed to success. His winnings mounted steadily, and his expression of smooth satisfaction seemed to grow with every coup. Signora Bullenty hovered near the roulette wheel, placing a few languid bets, her laughter rippling occasionally like the tinkle of crystal. Poirot followed the colonel at a discreet distance and saw him pause in the vestibule, where he stood for some minutes staring out into the night. When at last he turned back toward the stairs, his shoulders seemed to sag. It was the posture, Poirot thought, of a man who sees the walls closing in upon him. Shortly after midnight, Poirot retired to his own rooms, but even there the atmosphere of unease persisted. Through the open transom came the sound of footsteps, doors opening and closing, voices in low conference. At one point he heard distinctly a man's voice raised in anger, Arbuthnot's, followed by the sharper, cooler tone of Dullinge. There was a pause, then the slam of a door. The corridor outside fell silent once more, but Poirot remained standing for some time, frowning thoughtfully. There was, he reflected, a curious sense of inevitability about the whole affair. Events were moving forward with the relentless precision of a mechanism wound and set in motion. Soon, very soon, the spring would snap. The next morning broke overcast, a pale mist creeping in from the sea. Poirot, who had slept little, descended early and found the lobby nearly deserted. A solitary chambermaid passed with her feather duster, and at sight of Poirot she hesitated, then cutsud. "Monsieur," she said timidly, "it was a bad night, a very bad night. There were quarrels upstairs, loud ones. The English colonel, he was very angry, and the Italian lady, she was weeping. I heard her as she passed my pantry." Poit thanked her gravely, though his mind was already busy with the implications of this news. Quarrels, threats, tears, yes, the drama was nearing its climax. As he stepped out onto the terrace, the mist lifted slightly, revealing the shining dome of the casino. Somewhere within its gilded halls, Poit felt, the final act of the tragedy was even now preparing to unfold. The players had taken their positions, the stage was set, and soon, perhaps before another sunset, there would be death in Monte Carlo. The day passed with a peculiar, strained quietness, as though Monte Carlo itself held its breath. The sun never quite broke through the gray veil that hung over the town, and by afternoon a fine mist had settled upon the terrace, softening the outlines of the palms and casting the Place du Casino into a muted, silvery haze. To the casual visitor, it might have seemed an ordinary day. But to those who had followed the small dramas of the preceding week, there was a sense of something about to happen, some culmination that would draw together all the undercurrents and tensions into a single, inevitable moment. Hercule Poirot spent the morning in apparent idleness, walking the gardens, watching the sea from the balustrade, and taking a most carefully prepared luncheon. But behind the tranquility of his expression, the little Grusels were busy. The conversation overheard between Colonel Arbuthnot and Dullinge, the note in Evelyn Grant's bag, the chambermaid's report of late-night quarrels. All these were pieces of a puzzle that was not yet complete, but whose pattern was becoming clearer. In the early evening, Poit entered the casino. The great rooms were filled with the subdued murmur of voices, the clicking of roulette balls, the rustle of banknotes. The crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering points of light across the polished parquet floor. At the baccarat table, Colonel Arbuthnot was already seated, his face ruddy, his manner even more hearty than usual. He greeted several acquaintances with boisterous good humor, though Poit, watching from a little distance, thought the colonel's laughter had a curiously metallic note, as though it had been hammered into shape. Raoul Dullinge appeared shortly afterward, immaculate in evening dress, his expression one of faint amusement. He joined the game, and presently the two men were pitted against each other, staking heavily. Poit, standing at the rail, observed with keen attention. Evelyn Grant sat nearby, pale and silent, her eyes fixed upon the table as though she dreaded what she might see. Signora Bullanti, a vivid splash of emerald and diamonds, hovered near the roulette wheel, but her attention, too, seemed drawn toward the baccarat table. For a time the game proceeded quietly. The colonel lost several large coups, muttered something under his breath, and reached for his glass of champagne. Poit noted that he drank deeply, draining the glass in a single swallow. A few hands later he pushed his chair back abruptly, gathered his winnings, what little remained of them, and stood. "Not my night," he said, his voice unnaturally loud. "I'll try my luck another time." He turned and strode toward the marble steps that led down to the vestibule. A few moments later Poit, following at a leisurely pace, heard a curious sound, half gasp, half sigh, and then a cry went up. A small knot of players gathered at the foot of the staircase. Poit moved forward swiftly, his eyes narrowing. There, lying on the polished marble, was Colonel Arbuthnot. His face was strangely waxen, his eyes staring up at the painted ceiling with an expression of faint surprise. One hand was clenched tightly about a playing card, the Queen of Spades. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the faint strains of music from the distant ballroom. Then a woman gave a low cry, Evelyn Grant, and swayed as though she would faint. Poit caught her arm gently and led her to a chair. "Courage, mademoiselle," he said softly. "It is necessary to remain calm. The police, they must be summoned." The croupier hurried away, and soon the commissaire of police arrived, a tall man with an impressive moustache and a grave expression. The guests gathered in little groups, whispering, their faces pale in the brilliant light. Poirot knelt beside the body, his examination swift but meticulous. There was no sign of external violence. The colonel's evening dress was in perfect order, the bow tie neatly knotted, the shut-front unstained. Only the clenched hand with its strange token, the Queen of Spades, suggested that this was no natural death. "Heart failure," murmured Muttall, who had come to stand beside Poirot. Poirot shook his head slowly. "Perhaps, but we shall see, my friend, we shall see." The body was carried upstairs to a private room. Poirot followed, noting with keen eyes the expressions of those around him. Evelyn Grant was white to the lips, her eyes wide with shock. Dullinger's face betrayed no emotion, but there was a certain brightness in his gaze, as though he were already calculating the implications. Signora Bullenty wept noisily into a lace handkerchief, but her tears, Poirot thought, were a little too profuse. Later that night, the doctor confirmed what Poirot had suspected. Colonel Arbuthnot had not died of natural causes. There was digitalis in his system, enough to stop the strongest heart. Poirot stood very still, his hands folded behind his back. In his mind the pieces of the puzzle shifted and reformed. Poison, yes, poison was the weapon of the subtle murderer. And the Queen of Spades, that he felt sure was no accident. It was a message, a challenge. As the hotel settled into uneasy silence, Poirot returned to his suite. He stood for a long time at the window, gazing out at the moonlit Place du Casino. Below, the last motorcars were departing, their headlights sweeping across the misty square. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 2. "There is evil here," Poirot murmured softly. "Evil and a most ingenious mind. But we shall see, mon ami, we shall see." And with that he turned away, his face grave. The game had begun in earnest, and Hercule Poirot, who never shrank from a contest of wits, was ready to meet his adversary. Morning broke clear and bright, as though Monte Carlo had determined to efface the memory of the night before. The Mediterranean glittered under a sky of flawless blue, and from the terrace of the Hôtel de Paris the flower-beds blazed with color. But there was a new atmosphere abroad, hushed, strained. Guests moved quietly, voices were lowered, and the staff passed to and fro with solemn faces. The death of Colonel Arbuthnot had shaken the little community, and speculation ran rife. Hercule Poirot sat at his breakfast table, immaculate as always, though his expression was graver than usual. He consumed his coffee and rolls with mechanical precision, but his thoughts were elsewhere. In his mind he saw again the waxen face, the stiffly outstretched hand with its curious token, the Queen of Spades. A strange gesture that. To most men death comes with empty hands. Shortly after breakfast, Poirot was joined by the commissaire, who had come to take his statement. The two men walked together along the terrace, conversing in low tones. "You believe it was murder?" the commissaire asked gravely. "Mus certainement," Poirot replied. "The medical evidence it is conclusive. Digitalis in a dose most precise, not too much, not too little. It was the work of one who understands the human heart, both literally and figuratively." The commissaire nodded. "We have taken steps to keep the guests from departing. Your assistance, Monsieur Poirot, will be invaluable." Poirot inclined his head modestly, though in truth he felt the old, familiar quickening of the blood that came whenever he was pitted against an unknown adversary. The game was afoot. His first step was to speak with Evelyn Grant. He found her in the morning room, seated by the tall windows that overlooked the sea. She was dressed in black, her face pale, and her hands twisted the handkerchief in her lap until it was a crumpled ball. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "I must trespass upon your grief. There are questions that must be asked." She looked up quickly, her eyes wide and frightened. "Yes, yes, of course." "You were devoted to your guardian." "Yes," she said simply. "He was the only father I ever knew." Poirot nodded. Yet he was troubled, was he not? He had financial difficulties. Her lips trembled. "Yes, he had lost heavily at the tables, more than we could afford. And there were other things. He never told me everything, but I knew he had borrowed money. From M. Dullinge. She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I begged him not to, but he said there was no other way. And yesterday, he seemed to you different. Her eyes filled with tears. He tried to be cheerful, but I could see how strained he was. Last night before dinner, he told me that everything would soon be settled, one way or another. I didn't know what he meant. Poirot made a little sound deep in his throat. That is very interesting, mademoiselle. You will permit that I keep the note you dropped yesterday. She flushed. If you think it will help. Poirot bowed. Everything helps, mademoiselle. It is the small details, the apparently trivial facts that lead one to the truth. Leaving her, Poirot sought out Raoul Dullinge. He found the man seated in the lounge, smoking a cigarette with an air of studied composure. Monsieur Dullinge, Poirot began, taking a chair opposite, you were a friend of Colonel Arbuthnot. Dullinge raised his brows. Friend is perhaps too strong a word. We were acquaintances, nothing more. Yet you lent him money. Dullinge shrugged. I am not a usurer, Monsieur Poirot, but I saw that the colonel was in difficulty, and I am not without means. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. Poirot's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. And now that he is dead, you will claim your money from his ward. Dullinge's smile was faintly ironic. I am not without generosity, Monsieur Poirot. I shall make no claim until the lady is in a position to repay me. But debts, they must eventually be honored. Poirot nodded slowly. A most correct attitude, monsieur. Yet I must tell you something. The colonel was poisoned. Dullinge's eyes widened slightly, though the rest of his face remained composed. Poisoned? Mon Dieu, you suggest that I... Poirot held up a hand. I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely collect the facts. His next visit was to Signora Bellanti. She received him in her suite, reclining upon a chaise longue, a lace handkerchief pressed to her eyes. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, she said dramatically, this terrible thing, it has quite unstrung me. Poirot inclined his head sympathetically. You were acquainted with Colonel Arbuthnot. But yes, he was a charming man, so gallant, we spoke often. Even last night. A little color crept into her cheeks. Yes, we met in the corridor. I wished him good fortune for the evening. You slipped a note beneath his door, Poirot said softly. Her eyes widened. You know that. I know many things, Signora. The note, what did it contain? For a moment she hesitated, then said, it was foolish, very foolish. I warned him against Dullinge. I knew that man meant trouble. Poirot bowed gravely. You are most candid, Signora. It may be that your foolishness will help to bring the truth to light. By the time Poirot returned to his rooms, he had gathered many threads. The Riviera awoke to brilliance the next morning, as though the world had been scrubbed clean in the night. The sky was a deep, unbroken blue, the sea lay like a vast mirror of polished sapphire, and the early sunlight glinted off the marble balustrades of the Hôtel de Paris until they seemed edged with gold. Guests, subdued by the events of the previous evening, moved with hushed voices through the hall, as though unwilling to disturb the quiet dignity of the day. The death of Colonel Arbuthnot had been the single topic of conversation at breakfast. Speculation flourished, but certainty was absent. Hercule Poirot sat alone at his usual table, a small oasis of order amidst the uneasy atmosphere. His coffee steamed fragrantly, the rolls were perfect, the butter patted into neat curls. All was in harmony save for the thoughts that occupied the mind of the little Belgian. There was something almost ceremonial about the way he spread his butter, the precise manner in which he folded the napkin beside his plate, and yet his eyes, bright and watchful, were fixed on a point beyond the terrace, as though they might penetrate the very air and reach the truth that lay hidden somewhere in Monte Carlo's shining façade. Colonel Arbuthnot had not died by chance, that much was certain. The evidence of the medical man left no room for doubt. Digitalis had entered his system within the last hour of his life. It was not too crude a dose, no clumsy attempt to bludgeon nature, but measured, exact, the work of a cool, intelligent hand. And there was the other detail, curious, significant, the Queen of Spades clutched in the dead man's hand. That card had been placed there deliberately, of that Poirot was sure. Its meaning, that was the riddle, a jest, a threat, a message from the murderer to those who might seek him. After breakfast, Poirot moved quietly about the hotel, not to interrogate but to observe. The lobby was filled with the subdued murmur of conversation. Guests stood in little knots, their voices pitched low. One or two ladies wept discreetly behind lace handkerchiefs, while the men discussed the tragedy in clipped, precise phrases. Poirot's small, shining eyes passed over them, noting who spoke eagerly, who listened intently, who avoided the subject altogether. Evelyn Grant was among them, pale and drawn, her figure silhouetted against the tall windows that overlooked the terrace. She stood very straight, but her hands were clasped tightly together before her, betraying the strain beneath the surface. Poirot did not approach her then, but filed away the impression, the pallor of her face, the slight tremor that passed through her when the colonel's name was mentioned. She had loved her guardian, that was evident. But there was more fear, yes, and perhaps guilt, too. Poirot ascended to the upper floors, where the colonel's suite had been sealed for examination. The commissaire had given him permission to inspect it, and he did so with meticulous care. The rooms were spacious and elegant, filled with the faint smell of last night's cigars and the lingering trace of champagne. The glass from which the colonel had drunk stood upon a table near the window, a faint residue at the bottom catching the morning light. Poirot lifted it delicately, studying the rim with fastidious care. Yes, it was here, almost certainly, that the poison had been administered. On the writing desk lay a pack of cards, neatly squared, as though placed there by a man of orderly habits. Poirot's fingers turned them over one by one until he found the gap. The Queen of Spades was missing. His mustaches quivered. The card had been taken from this deck, not found at random in the gaming rooms. A deliberate choice, a piece of thuttra. The murderer had wished to send a message. But to whom? Returning to the lobby, Poirot lingered for a time near the writing desk, watching the life of the hotel flow past him. Raoul Dullinge crossed the hall with leisurely grace, pausing to light a cigarette. There was no trace of agitation in his manner, but Poirot noted the quick, appraising glance he cast toward Evelyn Grant as he passed. Dullinge was a man who measured opportunities, and Poirot had seen the look of a man calculating an inheritance more than once in his career. Later, as Poirot sat upon the terrace, Signora Bullenty emerged, resplendent in black satin, her eyes red from weeping. She swept past, pausing to exchange a few words with one of her admirers. Poirot watched her with interest. The signora's grief was extravagant, almost too much so. There was drama in her gestures, tragedy in the tilt of her head, as though she played a part upon a stage. And yet the night before she had been seen slipping a note beneath the colonel's door. A warning, a threat. Or perhaps an invitation. Poirot spent the afternoon quietly collecting impressions. He spoke little, but everywhere he went his eyes were busy. He saw Evelyn walking in the gardens, her head bent as though in thought. He saw Dullinge seated in the lounge, perusing a newspaper with an expression of cool detachment. He saw the signora writing a letter, her jalu hand moving rapidly across the page, then tearing the sheet in two and casting it into the fire with a gesture of annoyance. Each of these small scenes he stored away in his memory. When the day's post arrived, Poirot made discreet inquiry and learned that Colonel Arbuthnot had received 2 telegrams in the past week, one of them marked urgent. The hotel clerk, eager to be of assistance, recalled that the colonel had been visibly disturbed on reading the second. Another thread, another piece of the pattern. By evening the hotel had resumed some semblance of its usual life. Guests dressed for dinner, though the talk was still subdued, the clatter of plates and silverware muted. Poirot dined alone, eating with his usual care, but his thoughts were far from the menu. He was arranging his clues, setting them in order like chessmen upon a board. There were debts, there were quarrels, there were those who stood to gain by the colonel's death, and there was the poison, silent, secret, administered at just the right moment. As the last light faded from the sky and the lamps were lit, Poirot took a slow turn upon the terrace. The sea was dark now, the casino windows glowing like golden lanterns across the square. Somewhere in those gilded rooms, he reflected, walked a murderer calm, perhaps even triumphant, believing himself secure. But Poirot's little gras cells were hard at work, and already the shape of the solution was beginning to emerge. Soon, he told himself, very soon, the mask would slip. The truth, no matter how carefully hidden, could not remain concealed forever. The day after Colonel Arbuthnot's death dawned cloudless, and the glittering blue of the Riviera seemed almost insolent in its splendor. Yet within the walls of the Hôtel de Paris, a curious hush prevailed. The usual gaiety of the season had evaporated. Laughter was subdued, the soft shuffle of cards in the lounge sounded strangely loud, and the servants moved with a gravity befitting a house in mourning. Poirot rose early, his routine unaltered, but there was a peculiar energy in his movements as though the little gray cells had worked through the night. As he stood at the window, fastening the button of his immaculate waistcoat, his eyes traveled over the scene outside, the terrace still wet from the night's watering, the flower beds blazing with geraniums, the distant casino gleaming in the early sun. It seemed a place made for idleness, for harmless pleasures, yet Poirot knew too well that human passions were seldom harmless, and that beneath this glittering surface something dangerous still moved. He began his morning by reviewing the Colonel's suite once more. The rooms were unchanged, yet they seemed to Poirot charged with a curious tension, as though they still held the echo of their late occupants' despair. He examined the champagne glass again, noting the faint crystalline sediment at the bottom. The commissaire had arranged for chemical analysis, but Poirot already knew what the verdict would be. On the desk he found a single sheet of hotel stationery covered with rough figures, sums added and crossed out, amounts circled. The Colonel had been reckoning something, debts perhaps, or the means by which to discharge them. Poirot studied the paper with a faint frown. The figures did not balance. There was a missing amount, an entry struck through with a heavy line. In the afternoon, Poirot took to the promenade, walking slowly beneath the palms that lined the road. The air was warm, the scent of salt and flowers mingling in the light breeze, but Poirot's mind was far from tranquil. He thought of Evelyn Grant, pale and strained, of Delange, cool and smiling, of Signora Bellanti, weeping too loudly. Each of them had been near the Colonel on the night of his death. Each had something to conceal. Near the harbor, Poirot paused to watch a fisherman untangle his nets. The man worked patiently, methodically, extricating each knot with practiced fingers. Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile. It was an apt metaphor for the task before him. He, too, must untangle the knots, the lies, the half-truths, the motives hidden beneath layers of courtesy. That evening the casino resumed its usual brilliance, but the mood was different. The great chandeliers blazed as brightly as ever. The gowns and jewels of the women glittered, but there was a slight unease in the air, as though the patrons felt that fate might turn capricious at any moment. Poirot entered the gaming rooms quietly, moving among the tables with the unhurried grace of a man entirely at leisure, though his eyes missed nothing. Delange was at the baccarat table, his hands steady as he placed his stakes. Poirot observed the man's composure, too perfect, perhaps, and the little gleam of satisfaction that appeared when the banker turned a winning card. A man entirely sure of himself, thought Poirot, and one who believed that fortune, in more than one sense, favored him. Signora Bellanti stood near the roulette wheel, placing languid bets with a detached air, as though her mind were elsewhere. Her laughter, when it came, was brittle, quickly silenced. Poirot watched her closely. Guilt, he knew, could express itself in many forms, in tears, in sudden bursts of gaiety, in a desperate pursuit of distraction. And Evelyn was there, though she did not play. She stood by the far window, staring out into the night, her figure framed against the dark glass. She seemed untouched by the bustle of the gaming room, lost in some private world of dread and memory. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Here was a girl on the edge of endurance, her strength nearly spent. Later, when the tables emptied somewhat, Poirot made his way through the quieter salons. It was there, in a small withdrawing room, that he found the clue which was to bring the whole case into sharper focus. On a low table lay a discarded program from the previous night's concert. Poirot's eye, roving habitually over trifles, noted a faint brown mark on one corner, the smear of a liquid, perhaps wine or champagne. Beside it lay a playing card, face down. Poirot lifted it delicately, the Queen of Spades. For a long moment he stood motionless, the card held between finger and thumb, his mind leaping swiftly from point to point. Why here? Why not left with the body as the first had been? Was this the killer's second message, or something dropped inadvertently? The possibility that the murderer might have been careless excited him. He replaced the card where he had found it and withdrew silently. The net was tightening. He could feel it. Somewhere among the elegant throng that peopled the hotel and casino was the hand that had mixed the poison, that had placed the card between the dead man's stiffening fingers. As Poirot crossed the square, the night was very still. The lamps along the promenade cast pools of pale light on the cobblestones, and from the harbor came the faint creak of moored yachts. Poirot paused for a moment, gazing toward the sea. The case was moving toward its climax. He could sense it, as surely as one feels the air thicken before a storm. Back in his rooms, he sat for a long time in the silence, reviewing once more the facts. The debts, the warnings, the figures on the desk, the two cards of spades, one clenched in death, the other carelessly discarded. And then, suddenly, the pattern revealed itself, clear and precise as a solution in algebra. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The murderer had been clever, very clever, but not clever enough. The little gray cells had triumphed once more. All that remained now was to arrange the final scene, to draw the net tight, and to watch the guilty face reveal itself when the trap was sprung. He rose, smoothed his cuffs, and glanced at his reflection in the mirror. The hour was nearly come. Tomorrow, perhaps, the curtain would rise on the last act of the drama, and Hercule Poirot would be ready to deliver justice. The following evening, the Hôtel de Paris seemed unusually still, as though the very walls were aware that some momentous event was at hand. The air was warm and heavy, yet the terraces were almost deserted, the guests preferring to remain indoors. There was a subdued expectancy in the corridors, a faint whispering whenever two people passed each other. It was known that Monsieur Poirot, the celebrated Belgian detective, had requested the presence of certain guests in the private salon at 8 o'clock. No one doubted the purpose of that gathering. Poirot himself was calm, almost serene, as he made his way to the appointed room. The salon had been prepared under his direction. The lamps were shaded, the curtains drawn, the chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the center of the room. The polished parquet floor gleamed, and a faint scent of roses drifted in from the vases placed on the mantel-shelf. The atmosphere was one of quiet formality, as though the room awaited not a meeting but a performance, which, in a sense, it did. By 8 o'clock all were assembled. Evelyn Grant sat near the window, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Raoul Dullinge lounged elegantly in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his dark eyes faintly amused. Signora Bullenty was magnificent in black velvet, her jewels winking like small, defiant stars, while her secretary hovered at her elbow with anxious devotion. Jullez Muttal and the commissaire stood near the fireplace, grave and attentive. Poit remained standing for a moment, surveying them all. His small, rotund figure seemed to command the room. The lamplight gleamed on his patent leather shoes and cast a shadow that stretched, long and thin, across the floor. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, yet every ear strained to catch the words. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are assembled here to speak of the death of Colonel Arbuthnot. You know that he died suddenly in the casino 2 nights ago. At first it might have appeared that his death was natural, but no, the truth is otherwise. Colonel Arbuthnot was murdered." A faint stir ran through the room. Poit held up a hand for silence. "Yes, he was poisoned with digitalis, a drug that attacks the heart. The dose was administered shortly before he descended to the gaming rooms, and as you also know, when he was found, there was clutched in his hand a playing card, the Queen of Spades. Poirot paused, letting the image take hold in the minds of his listeners. To some, he continued softly, this might have appeared a mere coincidence, a freakish detail, but Hercule Poirot, he does not believe in coincidence. The card was placed there deliberately by the murderer to send a message. And 2 days ago, in a quiet salon of this hotel, I found another such card, a second Queen of Spades, carelessly dropped. The murderer had grown bold, perhaps careless, but it was enough. He moved slowly to the center of the room, his small hands clasped behind his back. Let us consider first the motive, he said. Colonel Whodunnit was in difficulties. He had lost heavily at the tables. He had borrowed money that was to be repaid before the week was out. If he failed, the inheritance of Mademoiselle Grant would be forfeit. There was quarreling, ah yes, more than one person heard the angry voices in the corridor on the night before his death. There was a warning slipped beneath his door, a warning he did not heed. And so, what happened? Poirot turned suddenly to Raoul Dullinge. Monsieur, you advanced money to the colonel, did you not? You pressed for repayment, and when he could not meet your terms, you saw that ruin approached. But for you, ruin would have been inconvenient. You wished for the debt to be repaid quickly, and you saw that the colonel was a desperate man. If he were to die, his ward's fortune, her entire inheritance, would pass into your power. Is it not so? Dullinge's dark brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. His smile, faint and ironic, did not falter. Poirot inclined his head. But you, monsieur, are not the murderer. You are too careful a man to act so rashly, and too cautious to leave behind so theatrical a symbol as the card. He turned next towards Signora Bullenty, who sat very straight, her dark eyes glittering. You, Signora, warned the colonel. You feared what might happen if he did not heed you. But your tears, ah, they were genuine. You loved the colonel, did you not? Your grief was no pretense. No, you are not guilty either. He paused, letting the silence lengthen until it seemed that the very air in the room had grown heavy. Then he turned to Evelyn Grant. Mademoiselle, he said gently, it is you whom we must consider. You loved your guardian, yes, but you also feared him. He had gambled away your fortune, he had borrowed against it, he had made you the hostage of his debts. And that evening before dinner he told you that everything would soon be settled, one way or another. You believed that he meant to take his own life to free you from the burden of his ruin, but you did not trust that he would do so, and so you acted first. There was a gasp from one corner of the room. Evelyn's face had gone very white. You poured the drug into his champagne, Poirot said quietly. You placed the card in his hand, a gesture of defiance, perhaps, or of bitter irony. The Queen of Spades, la Dame de Pique, the bringer of misfortune. You wished the world to know that his fate had come, and that it was you who had delivered it. For a long moment Evelyn did not move. Then very slowly she raised her head. Her eyes were dry now, her voice when it came was steady. Yes, she said simply, I killed him. No one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the still air like something solid. Poirot inclined his head gravely, as though acknowledging a tragic inevitability. You acted, he said softly, because you saw no other way. But there is always another way, mademoiselle. Justice will take its course, but perhaps it will be tempered by mercy. The commissaire stepped forward, laying a hand on the girl's shoulder. She rose without resistance. Her face was calm now, as though the strain that had gripped her had at last been released. As the door closed behind her, Poirot turned to the others. His face was grave, but there was a certain satisfaction in his eyes. It is finished, he said simply. The little Gracels, they have spoken. The dawn that followed was pale and cool. The Mediterranean washed in a thin veil of mist that softened the lights of the harbor and blurred the distant horizon. Monte Carlo seemed hushed, subdued, as though the town itself were recovering from a fever. The Hôtel de Paris stood serene against the morning light, its windows glinting faintly, its awnings still drawn. The bustle of the previous nights was gone. Only the discreet sounds of the servants laying breakfast drifted through the corridors. Poirot walked the terrace slowly, his cane tapping softly against the flagstones. The square before the casino was nearly empty, save for a few early risers strolling along the promenade. The air was fresh, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the faint sweetness of the flower beds. It was a morning for contemplation, and Poirot was content to take it thus. Justice, he reflected, had been served. Evelyn Grant was in the custody of the commissaire, her confession written, her fate now in the hands of the law. She had not resisted. Indeed, the calmness with which she had spoken the truth had suggested relief, as though the burden she had carried had at last been lifted. There would be scandal, of course, whispered through the salons of the Riviera, repeated in clubs in London. But perhaps, in time, there would be understanding. Poirot paused to look down over the balustrade at the sweep of the road below. It was strange, he thought, how human tragedy could play itself out beneath such splendor. The palms stood motionless in the still air, the sun was beginning to burn away the mist, and already the first carriages were drawing up to the casino steps. The world went on, it always did. He thought of Colonel Arbuthnot, hardy and bluff, undone by his own pride and his appetite for risk. He thought of the girl who had loved him and yet had felt cornered enough to end his life. And he thought of the Queen of Spades, the curious token clenched in the dead man's hand, a symbol at once of defiance and of fate. Even in death, the colonel had played his last card. Returning indoors, Poirot crossed the great hall where the hotel staff moved with quiet efficiency, restoring the place to its accustomed order. The echoes of the tragedy would fade. New guests would come, bringing with them fresh scandals, fresh dramas. Monte Carlo did not dwell on sorrow. In his suite, Poirot packed his small, fastidiously ordered valise. His holiday was at an end. He had come to Monte Carlo seeking rest, but instead had found crime, as so often happened. And yet, he admitted to himself with a small smile, he was not displeased. The little gray cells had been exorcised, the truth had been uncovered, and order so dear to Poirot's heart had been restored. When he descended to the lobby to settle his account, Jules Martle was there, hat in hand, waiting to bid him farewell. They exchanged polite words, but Poirot did not linger. He stepped out into the morning light, drew a deep breath of the sea air, and set off at his usual measured pace toward the waiting carriage. Behind him, the doors of the Hotel de Paris closed with a soft sound. Ahead, the sun climbed higher, gilding the waters of the Mediterranean. Monte Carlo was awake once more, its elegance unshaken, its charm as potent as ever a place of fortune and misfortune, of chance and destiny. Poirot paused for one last glance back at the casino, gleaming pale and beautiful in the clear light. Somewhere within those walls, another drama was perhaps already beginning, another turn of the wheel that would bring joy to some and ruin to others. Such was life here, always poised between triumph and disaster. With a small, satisfied nod, Hercule Poirot stepped into his carriage. The horse started forward, the wheels crunched softly over the cobblestones, and the little figure in the cream-colored suit was carried away down the sunlit road, leaving behind him a mystery solved, a tragedy laid bare, and a town that would remember, for a time, the night death came to the casino. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the glittering yet shadowed streets of Monte Carlo. If you enjoyed this Hercule Poirot mystery, please consider subscribing for more stories every day. Your support helps us bring you more of these quiet, thoughtful adventures. Until next time, keep your little gray cells sharp, and may your own mysteries be few and far between.